Welcome to Bedcrime Stories Podcast. I'm your host, T, and I welcome you to my channel, to my loyal bedcrimers. Hi, hope you're having a great day. To anyone new, a special welcome. Do me a favor after you watch the video, if you found you enjoyed it, please do me a favor and hit the like button. Now let's get started. We now know that Delphi suspect Richard M. Allen actually spoke to a conservation officer right after Libby German and Abby Williams lost their lives in 2017. Allen told this officer that he was in the area and on the Monenhigh Bridge on the same day as Libby and Abby. But Allen told the officer that he did not see the girls that day. Some have trouble understanding why Allen undertook such a risky move, essentially putting his name and face out in front of this conservation officer who did write the incident up. And people also want to know why Allen wasn't flagged right from the start because of this. Couldn't this crime have been solved much earlier if the police had taken Allen's statement more seriously? And in the meantime, if Allen was the perpetrator, did he commit any more crimes over the past 5.5 years? So far, no one seems to have any reasonable answers to any of those questions. There are different motivations for criminals to proactively interact with law enforcement. Let's assume Allen is indeed responsible for this crime just for the sake of argument. What are some possible reasons why he might have thought it prudent to approach the conservation officer and tell him his name and that he'd been hiking in the trail system and on the Monenhigh Bridge on the day Libby and Abby died? It may be that Allen wanted to try and find out what the authorities knew about the crime, and perhaps he thought this conservation officer might have some inside information. 2, it could be that Allen, who is a smoker, realized after the fact that he'd discarded a cigarette butt at some point during the crime and that the searchers might find it and have it tested for DNA. But that doesn't make a ton of sense because Allen had to have known that his DNA wasn't in CODIS because he'd never been arrested for a crime. 3, it could be that Allen feared someone else might have recognized him while he was hiking that day, and perhaps he wanted to get ahead of the story, as in admit it to the police before they find out from another source and come to his house to ask, "Why didn't you tell us you were on the Monenhigh Bridge on the same day as Libby and Abby?" Maybe Allen thought telling this conservation officer would make him look less like a potential person of interest and more like a good Delphi citizen who wants to help. 4, it could mean that Allen derived some sick pleasure out of interacting with an authority figure, in this case a conservation officer, even if it made his heart race for fear of getting caught. Some criminals feed off this type of excitement. I know that serialists, as in people who commit this crime multiple times on separate occasions, are generally not motivated by the normal things people commit crimes for. And by the way, I'm not saying 100% that Allen is a serialist. We don't even know for sure if he committed this crime. But a lot of experts keep saying that the crime has all the hallmarks of a serialist. Serialists are not generally motivated by material gain, as in robbing people for money, nor are they typically driven by personal grudges or desperate economic circumstances. Instead, a serialist's motivation tends to come from within, and it is often a combination of narcissistic and bodily compulsions. I am saying bodily compulsions because I can't say the actual word, which begins with an S and ends with the letters UAL. Sorry, but YouTube doesn't like that word. This cocktail of narcissistic and bodily compulsions frequently spurs serialists to engage in risky and irrational behavior. Things like revisiting a crime scene, communicating directly with the police or the press. Some serialists actually get addicted to their own notoriety, as was the case with Dennis Rader. We've all marveled at the photo of Richard Allen smirking in a local Delphi bar in front of a police sketch of Bridge Guy. I get the feeling Allen rather enjoyed pulling the wool over everyone's eyes in this manner. What else could explain that sly grin? As I try to understand more about the type of person who harmed Libby and Abby, I did some research on the common traits of serialists, and that's what I'm going to share with you now. Here are some of the specific traits of serialists as determined by criminal profilers over the course of many years. 1. Smooth talking but insincere. Perhaps no serialist better exemplifies this than Ted Bundy. Bundy capitalized on his good looks and silvery tongue to lure young women into his spider's web. Along with being attractive, Bundy also knew how to charm women. The looks combined with the charm made it easy for him to deceive women into following him to dangerous, isolated areas. Ann Rule, a former cop who became friends with Bundy, yes, a police person who became friends with Ted Bundy, she wrote, and I quote, "I liked him immediately, but people like Ted can fool you completely. I'd been a cop, had all that psychology, but his mask was perfect. I say that long acquaintance can help you know someone, but you can never really be sure. Scary." End quote. One of Bundy's primary ploys to entrap women was to go up to one and tell her that he needed help with his car. He'd convince them that he just needed another set of hands to fix whatever the car problem was. Once he got the female to the car, it was easy for Bundy to force her inside the vehicle, where she'd find there was no door handle on the inside and the door was locked. In fact, singer and musician Debbie Harry, otherwise known as Blondie, believes that she was picked up by Ted Bundy in New York City. Harry wrote the following in her autobiography called Face It. "I was trying to get across town to an after-hours club. A little white car pulls up, and the guy offers me a ride. So I just continued to try and flag a cab down, but he was very persistent, and he asked me where I was going. It was only a couple of blocks away, and he said, 'Well, I'll give you a ride.'" End quote. So Harry gets into the car, but quickly realizes her mistake. The VW Beetle was stripped down on the inside. The door had no handles. There was only a tiny crack in the window, and the driver smelled putrid. Debbie said she knew she had to act quickly. She began rolling the window down slowly, inch by inch, so as not to have him see her. She moved her arm out of the window and began flailing, trying to open the door from the outside. Harry wrote of that moment, "As soon as he saw that, he tried to turn the corner really fast, and I spun out of the car and landed in the middle of the street." End quote. If that really was Ted Bundy, Debbie Harry was one of the lucky few women that got away. There's also a YouTuber named Trisha of Web Sleuths who had the misfortune to interact with Ted Bundy in a shopping mall when she was a teenager. Bundy tried very hard to convince her to go out to the parking lot with him. Thankfully, Trisha resisted his charms, and upon seeing her cousin in the mall, had the perfect excuse to get away from Bundy. It sounds like Richard Allen has some of this superficial charm. He certainly had the people at CVS and the local bar seeing him as a very nice person, right? Characteristic 2 of serialists, egocentric and grandiose. Remember Jack the Ripper from jolly old London, England? Apparently Jack was very confident in his abilities and felt he would always outsmart the police, or bobbies as they're called in the UK. Jack sent taunting letters to the police. Here's one he wrote. Dear boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I have laughed when they look so clever and talk about being on the right track. That joke about leather apron gave me real fits. I'm down on ladies of the night, and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled. Grand work the last job was. I gave the lady no time to squeal. How can they catch me now? I love my work and want to start again. You will soon hear of me with my funny little games. I saved some of the proper red stuff in a ginger beer bottle over the last job to write with, but it went thick like glue and I can't use it. Red ink is fit enough, I hope, ha. The next job I do, I shall clip the lady's ears and send to the police officers. End quote. I can't read the rest to you because it's way too graphic, but Jack makes it clear that he believes himself to be smarter than the cops. And you could say that he was, because Jack the Ripper was never caught. Now, for me, what we learn from Jack from this letter may shed light on why Richard Allen was able to smirk in that photo where we see the police sketch of Bridge Guy on the wall behind him. If Richard Allen is found to be the perpetrator of the Delphi crime, perhaps Allen sitting there near that sketch was him enjoying an inside joke, thinking, I'm sitting right here in front of you all, and you dummies can't see the resemblance. The third characteristic of serialists is a lack of remorse or guilt. Rather than feel bad about their heinous deeds, serialists in general are often proud of their sprees and want people to know about them. What's interesting about this to me right now is that the handwriting expert I talked about in a previous video, Dr. Moselle Martin, noted that some of Allen's handwriting indicated to her that he is cold-hearted and emotionless, and while he may acknowledge in his brain that he is responsible for another person's death, that doesn't mean he feels any guilt about it. Let's say Allen is found guilty. Then let's look at the photos we see of him kissing his daughter on her wedding day, smiling while on a hike with his wife, doing his weird little jig while playing pool in the Delphi bar. Allen was clearly living his life and enjoying it. Doesn't appear that he was racked with guilt or so overcome with remorse that he wanted to go to the police and confess. Far from it. In fact, we've heard that he's refusing to cooperate with the police. That's hardly a man with a conscience, if he did do it. The fourth characteristic of serialists is a lack of empathy. I think it goes without saying that to be a serialist, you have to lack empathy for other human beings. Why else would you think it okay to commit such acts? If Richard Allen is convicted of this crime, we will know once and for all that he does lack empathy. Anyone who could harm two innocent young girls like Libby and Abby would have to be completely devoid of empathy. Little girls cry when they're afraid. Grown women do as well, as do men. Anyone who can see those young, frightened faces and hurt them is beyond feeling, beyond empathy, cold as ice. The fifth characteristic of serialists is being deceitful and manipulative. If Richard Allen is found guilty, that will mean that he was able to deceive pretty much the entire town of Delphi, including the police, into thinking he was the helpful worker at the CVS, even while standing behind the pharmacy counter on occasion with yet another police sketch of Bridge Guy right behind him. As for the manipulation part, I guess you could say that forcing Libby and Abby down the hill was the ultimate act of manipulation, although I believe Bridge Guy pulled that off not simply by using an authoritative, commanding voice and his position as an adult, but also through the use of a weapon in hand. Libby and Abby could have taken off running in different directions, but they didn't. I think it's because whatever weapon Bridge Guy had was enough to manipulate them into compliance, and neither girl was willing to abandon the other one, although I wish they would have run in different directions. Maybe one of them would still be here. Maybe both of them would still be here. Could that have freaked the perpetrator out and made him worry that one might get away and find an adult to track him down with? Maybe. We'll never know. John Wayne Gacy, the scary serialist who worked as a clown at times, refused to own up to the 28 boys who were later found deceased under his house. Gacy once said, and I quote, "I think after 14 years under truth serum, had I committed the crime, I would have known about it." End quote. Talk about a deceitful person. The evidence was literally under his house, and he still denied it. And by the way, Gacy's neighbors all said they liked him. Sound like someone else we know? The sixth characteristic of serialists is shallow emotions. One German serialist named Rudolf Pleil compared his hobby of doing people in to playing cards, and later told the police, and I quote, "What I did is not such a great harm, with all these surplus women nowadays. Anyway, I had a good time." End quote. That's cold. Yes, it's hard for the rest of us to understand how another human being can find some sort of enjoyment in this stuff. That's what separates us from them. If Richard Allen did this, then I have to believe the kiss he laid upon his daughter's cheek in that wedding photo was a display and not pure heartfelt emotion. You can't do in two young girls belonging to other families and then really feel love for your own daughter. I don't think so. I don't think the person who committed this crime is capable of loving anyone. The seventh characteristic of serialists is impulsivity. According to experts, impulsivity reflects a behavioral tendency toward rapid action with diminished ability or willingness to consider future consequences. One serialist who operated in the Midwest and the South would see a woman at a convenience store and then decide to follow her home. The impulse to follow them, these women, and later harm them was something this serialist said he could not control. And it certainly sounds risky. I mean, following a random woman to her home, not knowing what you're going to confront there, is definitely risky. The handwriting expert that I talked about, Dr. Moselle Martin, mentioned that Richard Allen's handwriting told her that he has a great degree of self-loathing and often thinks of unaliving himself. If all this is true about Allen, and if Allen is found guilty of this crime, I wonder if part of his self-loathing is down to feeling unable to control his impulses. The eighth characteristic of serialists is poor behavior control. This refers to expressions of irritability, annoyance, impatience, threats, aggression, and verbal abuse, and an inadequate control of anger and temper. We know so little about Richard Allen. The one call to 911 made by his wife Kathy was when Allen was allegedly drunk, and the call was deemed of a domestic nature. I'm not sure if that means it was a DV call. I tend to think so. Certainly, Kathy Allen must have been afraid of her husband to take the step of dialing 911. It makes me wonder if perhaps Allen was displaying poor behavioral control that night, and maybe they were at an extreme level. The ninth characteristic is a need for excitement. One serialist named Albert Fish, who committed unspeakable crimes, even found the idea of his own death exciting. He said, and I quote, "Going to the chair will be the supreme thrill of my life." End quote. Let's say Richard Allen committed this crime. The only motive that I can think of for this is some kind of sick pleasure, some sort of excitement in his sick mind, because he clearly didn't do it to rob the girls. He didn't do it out of revenge. They were innocent children who'd never done anything to him. The only motivations that come to mind are related to a sick need to have power over others, and possibly the added act of some form of SA. I do believe the girls' deaths are rooted in SA. That's just my opinion. We don't know that yet. Let's say that Allen is found guilty. I think him having his photo taken in front of the police sketch of Bridge Guy in that bar, and also going up to the conservation officer on the day Libby and Abby died, and letting the officer know he was on the Monon High Bridge but didn't see them, it all may come down to some sort of sick excitement inside Allen's head. The 10th characteristic is a lack of responsibility. John Wayne Gacy, who I already mentioned, once said, and I quote, "I see myself more as a victim rather than a perpetrator. I was cheated out of my childhood. I should never have been convicted of anything more serious than running a cemetery without a license. They were just a bunch of worthless little men and punks." End quote. Cold. That's just so cold. Can you imagine the audacity of saying such things? Now, I see some of this lack of taking responsibility in Richard Allen's letter asking for a lawyer. I know he hasn't been committed of the crime, but the way he talks about losing his job and his wife no longer being able to keep her job either, and him having to throw himself at the mercy of the court, makes it seem like he doesn't believe that his own actions may have led him to being in this position. Characteristic number 11, early behavior problems. A number of studies have focused on some of the most well-known cases of serialists, and many of these serialists have reported abuse in their childhoods. John Wayne Gacy, Gary Ridgway, and Ed Gein are three of the most infamous serialists who were abused as children. The only things we know so far about Richard Allen is that he was somewhat quiet in high school, a guy who walked with his shoulders hunched over and his head down, and the few high school classmates of Allen's who've talked have said that his family, his parents and sister, are good people. If Allen is convicted, it will be interesting to find out if he suffered any issues of this nature as a child. Characteristic 12, adult antisocial behavior. Serialist Gary Ridgway pleaded guilty to doing in 48 women, and most of them were ladies who worked at night, if you know what I mean. For Ridgway, these women made for easy prey, and as an added bonus, they were rarely reported missing by their families. Ridgway once said, and I quote, "I preyed upon the weak, the harmless, and the unsuspecting. This lesson I was taught by others. Might makes right." End quote. In the Delphi case, Libby and Abby were vulnerable due to three factors: their young ages, just 14 and 13, their position once they were across that bridge, and at that point the perpetrator had them pretty much cornered, and the third reason Libby and Abby were vulnerable was because they didn't have any weapons or might to fight back with. It just occurred to me that all of us should take pepper spray or even bear spray with us when we walk. I wonder if Libby and Abby had had such spray with them if they could have blasted Bridge Guy in the eyes at some point. Clearly, whoever harmed these girls displayed antisocial behavior. You cannot harm little girls in that manner unless you're utterly antisocial. But again, that antisocial quality on the inside is often masked by superficial charm on the outside. We've all heard that many in Delphi found Richard Allen to be a nice guy, a helpful worker at the CVS, a fun pool player at the local bar, and a person you'd least likely associate with Bridge Guy. Until the next time on Bed Crime Stories, if you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button, leave me a comment, subscribe if you're not yet subscribed. Consider joining my membership as a way to support my work here, or you could leave a one-time donation on my Patreon. Any support is greatly appreciated.